rupees of tax per unit is imposed by the government, and consumers are paying 118. Consumers are paying 118. So how much would go into producer's pocket? Anyone? No idea, right? So think about this. Consumers come to the shop, they buy the product for 180, right? And then out of this amount, 20 rupees has to be paid to the government. 20 rupees has to be paid to the government. So how much will go into producer's pocket? How much goes into producer's pocket? Students, is this clear or not? Right? Now I'm making a new rule. In case you don't say anything, you don't ask me a question, I'll assume everything is clear, right? Is this good, right? Okay, now this is what goes into producer's pocket. Now you can see for yourself that out of 20 rupees, 18 rupees were paid by consumers. So that means almost how much of the tax was paid by? How much of 18 divided by 20 is how much? How much of the tax was paid by? Right? 90% of the tax was paid by consumers, and the remaining 10% was paid by producers. Why so? Because the demand was inelastic. Demand was inelastic, and therefore it was easier for the producers to transfer the burden to the consumers. Now, when we look at another example, in this case, I'll assume that the demand is elastic. Demand is elastic, and it's the supply that is inelastic. Demand is elastic, and it's the supply that is inelastic. So that's why I have kept supply steep. You can see for yourself, supply is steep and demand is less steep. Yes or no? Right? Let's make demand even less steep. Right? So this is the demand and this is the supply. Any confusion so far? Students, is everyone clear on this? Okay. Now, initial equilibrium in the market was where the, just a second. Initial equilibrium in the market was where the original supply and demand were equal. So that was at this point where this much was the price, this much was the price per unit, right? Per unit before government imposed indirect tax, and let's assume that was 100 rupees and 5 million units were being bought and sold. Okay. Now then what happened? Government imposed an indirect tax. Same example we're taking, 20 rupees per unit, right? So when government imposed an indirect tax, we do know that that increases the cost of production. So your supply curve will shift upwards like this. Your supply curve will shift upwards like this. Any confusion so far, right? Now your supply curve has shifted to the left. We good? Okay. Now the new equilibrium, students, will be where the new supply curve is intersecting with the demand. New supply curve is intersecting with the demand. So this is the price that consumers will pay, right? Now you connect it to the y-axis and you label it as PC. So consumers are paying a price of how much? Let's say out of 20 rupees, consumers are only paying 105 additional rupees compared to what they were paying before, because previously they were paying 100 rupees per packet. Now they're paying 105, right? Now what you need to do, you need to bring the point from the new equilibrium down to the old supply curve, down to the original supply curve, old supply curve, whatever you want to call it, right? Now, when that happens, you can see for yourself, it intersects at this point, right? Then you connect it to the y-axis, and then you see that how much will be the price that producers will get. How much price will producers get? Just a second. Okay, now producers in this case are getting a price of PP, right? Now, if consumers buy this product for 105, and out of this amount, 20 needs to be paid to the government. So technically, how much goes into producer's pocket? How much goes into producer's pocket? Only 85. Now, in this example, compared to the previous example, who's facing a bigger burden of tax? Who's facing a bigger burden of tax? Producers, right? Because compared to previous amount of 100, now they're only receiving 85. So this means that out of 20 rupees, 15 rupees were contributed by the producers. So 75% of the tax was paid by producers, and only 25% of the tax was paid by consumers. Why so? Because in this case, supply was inelastic. In this case, supply was inelastic, right? Right? Whereas Supply was inelastic. Yeah, in this case, supply was inelastic, so more burden of tax was on the producers. And in this case, demand was more inelastic, and that's why more burden of tax was on consumers. Any confusion so far? Anything that anyone did not understand, anything that anyone wants to ask me, right? If this is clear, then move on. Okay, now we are about to look at the graph for subsidy, right? Now we'll do the same thing. In the first case, we'll take demand to be inelastic. And in the second case, we'll take supply to be inelastic. So let's first take demand to be inelastic, right? And we do know why subsidies are provided. What's the purpose of a subsidy? I did tell you yesterday in detail, but we can do a quick recap. So subsidies are provided on merit goods. What are merit goods? Things that are beneficial for consumers, but they do not fully realize the benefit, therefore they underconsume, right? Okay. Now, an ideal example of a merit good would be vaccination, right? People will not consume, or people will not get as much vaccination in case those are not cheap. So to make vaccination cheaper, the government provides subsidies. Got it? Easy, simple, good. Okay, now let's keep moving. Now the first thing, as I said, will make demand inelastic. So demand curve would be steep, right? And will make supply elastic, right? So supply is elastic like this, right? So this is your supply curve, this is your demand curve, right? Okay, now where's the original equilibrium? The original equilibrium, let's take the same examples, that original price is 100 rupees per unit and there is a subsidy of 20 rupees per unit provided, right? Okay, now this is your original equilibrium, right? Let's label it as E1, right? So this was your original price, equilibrium price, and this is your equilibrium quantity, right? Okay. Now, when government provides subsidies, what happens to your supply? Your supply shifts to the right because cost of production is reducing. Your supply curve will shift to the right like this. Got it? Easy? Any confusion? Right? So parallel shift to the right. So your supply has shifted to the right. Right? Where's the new equilibrium, students? The new equilibrium is at this point. So this is E2. This is E2. Now what you need to do, you need to connect this point to the y-axis. You'll connect this point with the y-axis to see, just a second. You'll connect this point to the y-axis to see this is always a challenge. Just a second. You'll connect this point to the y-axis to see how much price the consumers are paying now. Right now, obviously, consumers are paying a price less than P1. Why? Because with subsidy, what happens? I did tell you yesterday that whenever government provides subsidy on a product, the benefit is split between consumers and producers. Right? The benefit is split between consumers and producers, and the price of the product decreases. So if previously consumers were paying 100 rupees per unit, now with subsidy of 20 rupees per unit, let's assume consumers are paying 85. How much are consumers paying? 85 rupees per unit. Okay, now what do you need to do next? You will take this new equilibrium point up to the old supply curve. You bring this dotted line, you draw this dotted line straight up to the previous supply curve, and then you connect that to the y-axis. Then you connect that to the y-axis to see how much price the producers will receive. So that will be your PP. So the price that producers will receive is how much? 105. How do we know it will be 105? Because consumers come to the shop, they buy the product for 85 rupees. Now, for each unit produced, government is also giving producers 20 rupees, right? So 20 plus 85 gives you a total amount of 105. So this is the price that goes into, or this is the amount that goes into producer's pocket. Got it, students? Easy, good on this, right? Now, what did we learn from this example? That when demand was inelastic, when it was steep, who received more benefit of subsidy? Consumers. Confusion so far? Any confusion, students? Anything that's not clear? Anything you want to ask me? Is everything clear? We're good? Can you move on? Okay, now if this is clear, now we'll do one last example to see where supply is inelastic. In the case of subsidy, when supply is inelastic, right? Who will get more burden? Who will get more benefit, sorry, not the burden, more benefit of the subsidy. Okay. Now on the y-axis, we will take the price per unit. On the x-axis, we will have the quantity of that good. Let's assume vaccination or whatever, right? Now, first things first, you have to make a downward sloping demand curve. Let's keep it less steep because that's more elastic. And then we will have supply that's inelastic. Supply is inelastic, demand is elastic. So supply is inelastic, as you can see, it's a steep line, and demand is elastic, right? Got it? Okay. Now where the supply and demand curves intersect, that will be the original equilibrium. So the original equilibrium would be where the supply intersects with the demand, right? Okay. Now this will show you the original equilibrium, right? So 100 rupees per unit, and whatever this quantity is, you can take a value, right? And okay, over here. Now, what happens next? When the subsidy is provided, your supply curve shifts to the right. Your supply curve shifts to the right like this. Got it? Easy. We good on this? Okay. Now, your supply curve shifts to the right like this. Okay. Now, at the new equilibrium, where the new supply curve is intersecting with the demand, that is this point, right? So we will label it as E2 because this is the new equilibrium. Now, we connect this point with the y-axis to see how much price consumers are paying, right? So consumers are, let's say, paying, in this case, 90 rupees, right? Consumers are paying 90 rupees, or you can, not 90, let's make it 95. Consumers are paying 95 rupees. Got it? Now, what you need to do next, you need to take this dotted line from the new equilibrium. You need to take this point from the new equilibrium to the old supply curve. So all you have to do is to just draw this dotted line up to the new, this dotted line up to your supply curve. Got it? And then you connect it to the, y-axis, right? Then you connect it to the y-axis, right? So this is the price that producers will receive. And how much is the price that producers will receive? So with 20 rupees of subsidy, 95 is being paid by consumers, 20 rupees is coming to producers directly from the government. So that makes a total of 115. That makes a total of 115. Got it? So who received more benefit of the subsidy? The producer. Who received more benefit of the subsidy? The producer. Got it? You good on this? Right? So rule of thumb, I mean, in simple words, when demand is inelastic, consumers face more burden of the tax, and when demand is inelastic, consumers benefit more from the subsidy, and vice versa, right? So in both the cases, whichever of the two will be inelastic. So if demand is inelastic compared to supply for indirect taxes, consumers face more burden. If supply is more inelastic than demand, in the case of indirect taxes, producers face more burden of the tax. And similarly for the subsidy, when demand is inelastic, consumers benefit more from the subsidy. And when supply is inelastic, right, producers get more benefit of the subsidy. Any confusion so far? Anything that you did not understand, anything that you think needs more explanation? Yeah, think about it. Are we good? Is everything clear? Okay, so if everything is clear and we are good, then we can move forward. Okay, perfect, great. Okay, now let's keep moving. Yesterday, towards the end of the class, I said I'll explain you what happens to consumer and producer surplus when subsidy is provided, right? So the next thing that we are about to look at, what happens to consumers and producer surplus when subsidy is provided. Right? Okay. Now we already know for indirect taxes that when indirect taxes are imposed, right? What happens to consumer and producer surplus? Both consumer and producer surplus decrease. Why? Because consumers are paying a higher price and producers are receiving a lower price, right? And together they are contributing this amount of tax money which is going to the government, right? So both consumers and producer surplus decreases, right? And if you remember in yesterday's class, we also looked at the exact region of loss of consumer surplus and the loss of producer surplus. Similarly, in today's class, in this right now, we'll look at that what happens to consumer and producer surplus when subsidy is provided, right? Now we'll make a normal subsidy graph, right? In which we will, first of all, just label the axes, right? So you have price per unit on the y-axis, you have quantity of that product on the x-axis, right? Then you will have normal simple downward sloping supply, normal downward sloping demand, normal upward sloping supply, right? Okay, right? Okay. So initial equilibrium, we know initial equilibrium is where the two intersect. So that is this point, and we connect it to the y-axis to know the equilibrium quantity, right? So Q1 is the equilibrium quantity, P1 is the equilibrium price. Okay. After this, what happens when subsidy is provided? Supply curve shifts to the right, like this. Supply curve, supply curve shifts to the right, like this. Got it? Okay. Now, think about this. What's the new price that consumers are paying? Where the new supply curve intersects with demand, that shows the new price that consumers are paying. And as I said, it will be lower than the previous price level because obviously government is providing compensation to the producers to reduce the price, right? Subsidy is what? Financial payment that government provides to producers, which reduces the price of the good, right? Now, this is the price that consumers are paying. Now, what you need to do next, you take this point of new equilibrium up to the old supply curve and you connect it to the y-axis to see how much will producers make. How much will producers make? So where this is PP, this is the price that producers will get. Any confusion so far? You good on this, students? Okay. Now comes in the main part, that what is the change in consumer and producer surplus after provision of subsidy? Now think about this. Let's first talk about the consumer surplus. What is consumer surplus? Consumer surplus is the area, like how do we show consumer surplus? Area below demand curve and above price. So what was the previous price that consumers were paying? What was the previous price that consumers were paying? So this was the equilibrium price, and the entire region wherever this demand curves intersects, right? So it was the entire region was, let me use the same color, right? So it was the area below demand curve and above price. So it was this bigger triangle. It was this bigger triangle that showed the amount of consumer surplus. Easy, good on this? Any confusion so far? But how much is the new price that consumers are paying? Now, after subsidy, consumers are paying a price level of PC. So this is after subsidy, this orange line, right? And the yellow one that I made was before subsidy. Confusion? So this one was before subsidy and the other one is after subsidy, right? We good? Okay. Now, the new consumer surplus, so now you have to listen to this carefully, right? The new consumer surplus is the area below demand curve, right? And above price. What is the new price level? I've just shown you. So this trapezium, if you see, look at it carefully, this trapezium that I'm about to shade, in fact, let's get rid of these extra lines here, right? So this area, which is again a trapezium, shows you the increase in consumer surplus, which was previously not part of the consumer surplus, but now it has become part of consumer surplus because the prices have reduced. Confusion? Anything that's not clear? So this is your gain in consumer surplus. Any confusion so far? Anything that's not clear? right? We good? Okay. Students, is this making sense? Right? Okay. Now, what was producer surplus before subsidy? What was producer surplus before subsidy? Let me get rid of this, right? Okay, let's also get rid of this. So your producer surplus before subsidy was, think about it, area below price. This was the price that producers were receiving previously. Area below price and above supply. Below price and above supply. So that was all this region. That was all of this region that I'm shading in front of you. Right? This was your original producer surplus. Got it? Okay. This one as well, right? This was your previous producer surplus. Now, what's the new price that producers are receiving? So the new price that producers are receiving is this much. Yes or no? Now, as per the definition of producer surplus, what will be the new area of producer surplus? Area below price and above supply. So this additional trapezium has come under producer surplus region, which was previously not part of it, right? Now, if I shade this, you'll see that this will show you the gain in producer surplus. What will this show you? This will show you the gain in producer surplus. Yes or no? Got it? So now what does it shows? That in case of subsidy, both the consumer and producer surplus are increasing. So the gain of consumer surplus is this region that I'm just about to read, shade for you. So this region, this trapezium, right? This is the gain in consumer surplus, and this upper pink shaded region is the gain in producer surplus. That's the gain in producer surplus. Easy? We good on this? Any confusion so far? Anything that's not clear? Right? So in case of subsidy, both consumers and producers benefit. In case of subsidy, both consumers and producers benefit, right? Okay. After subsidy. Okay, now you tell me. Now have a look at this. That's a good question. Then let's look at this one more time, right? So what's the definition? Producer surplus region is below price and above supply. Everyone listen to this carefully. Below price and above supply. So previously, how much was the price that producers were receiving? This much. So that means it would be everything below this and above supply, which is this much. Are you getting me? I'm shading in front of you, right? Below price, because this was the previous price that producers were receiving. This was your supply curve, original supply curve, right? So this entire region, excuse my drawing, it's not very neat, but this entire region showed you your producer surplus previously. Yes or no? Now, what's the new producer surplus? Then, right? Who asked me the question? Yeah, then, so it will be the new producer surplus will be the area below price. Now, why is this the new price? Because this is the new price that producers are receiving, right? Below price and above supply. So it has included this region as well, which was previously not available. It has included this region, this trapezium, this pink trapezium that I've shaded. So that means what? That means that this pink shaded region, this one, is your gain in, this is gain in your producer surplus. Does it make sense? Then, did this help? So this was gain in consumer surplus, and this was gain in your, like this, right? So this is gain in consumer surplus, this low one, and this upper one is your gain in producer surplus, right? So just remember the definition and that would be easier for you, right? That Consumer surplus is below demand, consumer surplus is below demand and above price, and producer surplus is below price and above supply. I repeat, consumer surplus is below demand and above price, market price, and producer surplus is below market price and above supply, right? But in questions of indirect taxes and subsidy, what becomes a little complicated is to see that what was the original price. This would always be the original price, where the original supply and original demand intersects. And the new price will be different for the consumers and for the producers in case of both indirect taxes and subsidies. So that's the trick part. So that's the trick part, right? Okay, now this being said, let's talk about how much is the amount of expenditure that the government will make on this policy. How much is the amount of expenditure that the government will make on this policy? Like, what is the total amount that the government is spending on the subsidy? What is the total amount government is spending on the subsidy? Can anyone tell me? How much is the total amount the government is spending on this subsidy? Yeah. Think about it, right? What is the amount of subsidy per unit subsidy? The amount of per unit subsidy is difference between PP and PC. Have a look at this. In this case, it was 20 rupees, right? So 20 rupees was subsidy per unit. So if I have to calculate the total amount of subsidy, right? Let me write it down over here. So if I have to calculate the total amount of subsidy, total amount of subsidy that will be subsidy per unit, right? Subsidy per unit times the quantity times new Q, new quantity, right? And what was the new quantity? This was the new quantity, right? Yes or no? This was the new quantity, right? Similarly, if you look at this amount per unit times the new quantity. So that means what? It will be this entire region which I'm about to shade. So the area of this rectangle, length into breadth. What is the length? Q2 is the length. From 0 to Q0 is the length of it. And how much is the breadth? This much is the breadth, right? So the area of this rectangle would represent the amount of expenditure that the government will make to provide this subsidy. It's the area of this rectangle that the government is spending on, this is the expenditure on subsidy that the government is making. Is making sense, students? Is this clear? Any confusion so far? Anything that's not clear, right? So tomorrow we can do some questions related to MCQ questions related to these things, because only then you will help better understand, right? But I hope that everything is clear. There's no confusion about this. Students? Yeah. So tomorrow I can identify some MCQs that we can do so that you can you can better absorb the concepts that are involved. Right? But still, if there's any questions, please ask me right now. Good? No confusion, nothing, everything is good. Zain, Khizr, Khatija. Okay, so if everything is good, then we'll stop here for today and tomorrow we'll continue from here, right? Good? Okay, so I'll see you tomorrow. Take care and have a good night. Bye.